Of the Jule Smith Museum of Fine Arts at Auburn University. I'm here in the auditorium tonight with staff and colleagues, but since we're physically distanced, I'll be able to remove my mask. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Third Thursday Poetry and the presentation of the Auburn Witness Poetry Prize, a collaboration with the Southern Humanities Review. For both our series regulars and newcomers alike, Third Thursday Poetry, normally set against the vibrant backdrop of art on view at the museum, offers time to relax, socialize, and consider intersections between the visual and literary arts. No matter, for despite our being apart because of the pandemic, we do remain connected, including by this virtual experience. Academic museums such as Auburn's are unique places to explore, experience, and engage with the arts, and we proudly contribute to the intellectual life of the university through college partnerships like this one. For faculty or students viewing tonight, we welcome the chance to share our collection with you and collaborate on object-based engagement opportunities. We recently launched our new collections database found on our website at jcsm.auburn.edu. There you'll find resources to augment your areas of study, perhaps even ones that will surprise you, or works that afford space for personal reflection. Also, the museum is open this semester with reduced capacity should you wish to spend some time away from the screen. Let me conclude by thanking everyone for joining us this evening and also acknowledging the Alabama State Council on the Arts, which also provides funding for this literary arts program. And now I'm pleased to introduce Caitlin Taylor, Managing Editor of the Southern Humanities Review.
Thank you, Cindy. Good evening. My name is Caitlin Taylor, and I am the Managing Editor for Southern Humanities Review, the literary quarterly out of Auburn University. Southern Humanities Review has had a long tradition of publishing creative poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. We have been engaging not just with the Southern literary world, but with the national and global literary world since 1967. For 7 years now, we have proudly held the Auburn Witness Poetry Prize contest in honor of Jake Adam York. Each year, we hope the prize will do a number of things. We hope it will pay a poet for his or her or their creative labor because we value this labor. We hope it will shed light on the resilience of humanity in the face of strife. We hope it will put emerging writers into conversation with well-established writers, and we hope it will honor the legacy left by Jake Adam York, an Auburn alumnus and celebrated poet who passed away in 2012 and whose work has left a mark on the poetry world. This year, we are thrilled to publish the finalists and runners-up for our prize, poets like Juby Ariola Headley, Ariana Benson, Leslie McIntosh, Bethany Schultz-Hurst, Marissa Tirado, Annie Woodford, and Aisha Ajani, as well as our winner, Matt Donovan. These poets sent us their words about police brutality, the long history of slavery in the United States, loved ones who have been lost to cancer, and the exploitation of the working class. It is our privilege to share these poems with our readers. I want to thank everyone who makes this prize possible, but I want to especially thank the poets who trust Southern Humanities Review with their words, without which this prize would not exist. Thank you to you all. And now, please let me introduce creative writing graduate student Kalista Malone, who will introduce our poets for the evening.
Thank you, Caitlin. This year's winner of the Southern Humanities Review Witness Prize, Matt Donovan, is the director of the Poetry Center at Smith College and comes to us tonight from Massachusetts. He published his collection of poetry Vellum in 2007 and the chapbook Rapture and the Big Bam in 2017, where he, quote, summons figures ingrained in American culture to portray collisions of pleasure with tragedy and to offer evidence for what creation can cost. James Longenbach wrote of Vellum, Donovan confronts not only the power of art, but also its potential uselessness, its beauty inextricable from its unnerving refusal to serve." End quote. Additionally, he has published a collection of essays around the eruption of Mount Vesuvius and of the burial of Pompeii, called "A Cloud of Unusual Size and Shape: Meditations of Ruin and Redemption," published in 2016. Donovan has won many awards in addition to the Witness Prize, including a Rome Prize in Literature, a Whiting Award, a Pushcart Prize, and a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship. In 2016, he also received a capital grant for the Chamber Opera Inheritance, which opened at the University of California of San Diego in 2018. Of her choice of Donovan's poem, "The Etymology of Gazebo," as the winner of the 2020 Witness Poetry Prize, Reg Doll said, "One of the hardest things to write is a poem that responds to a galvanizing national event, without dissolving into sensational imagery or simplifying outrage. This is a poem that certainly expresses outrage, but does so with such a careful attention to our language of memorialization and of memory that the reader is able to feel both the tremendous and violent loss of Rice and the insufficiency of our ability to remember itself, an insufficiency supported by the hollowness of our own worlds. It's a delicate, ambitious, and moral poem that manages to balance a startling array of tones." The judge for the 2020 Witness Prize is Paisley Rekdal. She is speaking to us from Salt Lake City, Utah, where she is the Poet Laureate of the state and a distinguished professor at the University of Utah. Rekdal is the author of a number of books, including 6 collections of poetry, A Crash of Rhinos, 6 Girls Without Pants, The Invention of the Kaleidoscope, Animal Eye, Imaginary Vessels, and Nightingale. She's also written 2 books of essays that include hybrid photo text memoirs called The Night My Mother Met Bruce Lee and Intimate, an American family photo album. Her nonfiction book essay called The Broken Country on Trauma, a Crime, and the Continuing Legacy of Vietnam looks at the, quote, long-term cultural and psychological effects of the Vietnam War, end quote, following the murder of a veteran experiencing homelessness in Salt Lake City. Forthcoming in the W.W. Norton is her essay on cultural appropriation called Appropriate, a Provocation. In addition to her writing, Rekdal is also a guest editor for the Best American Poetry in 2020 and the creator and editor of community web projects Mapping Literary Utah and Mapping Salt Lake City. In Rhino Poetry, Luisa A. Gloria said this of Rekdal's latest poetry collection, Nightingale, which reimagines the myths of Ovid's Metamorphoses, quote, "Rekdal's poems are fearless in their application of extended muscular thought, at the same time that they brim with lyric exploration," end quote. Rekdal has received an Academy of American Poets Poet Laureate Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Amy Lowell Poetry Traveling Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship to South Korea, and a Civitella Ranieri Residency, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, Pushcart Prizes in 2009 and 2013, Narratives Poetry Prize, and the AWP Creative Nonfiction Prize, and various state Art Council Awards. Matt Donovan will read first, followed by Paisley Rekdal. Please join us in welcoming and congratulating Donovan and Rekdal.
Thank you so much, Kalista. I'm really sorry not to be there in person in Alabama today, but I am completely honored to be the recipient of this year's Auburn Witness Prize. I want to extend a thanks to Paisley Rekdal for those words about my poem and for responding to my work. It means an enormous amount to me. So thank you, Paisley. I also I want to thank Kalista for the introduction, and also to Rose and Caitlin and everyone at the Southern Humanities Review. I received my copy in the mail yesterday. It was a thrill to get that. The issue looks beautiful. So thank you for all the work that you did in assembling the issue, and then to everyone tonight who made tonight's program possible. I want to say too, I am truly humbled to be the recipient of an award that honors Jake Adam York. He's a writer who I admire a great deal. I only had the good fortune of meeting him just the once. But I've been reading him again this summer, and his body of work is more important now than ever in terms of its explorations of civil rights and our America's legacy of racial violence. Also, just as a writer, I absolutely love his use of syntax, and I feel like I learned so much from him. So I'm really grateful for everything tonight. So thank you so much. I'll read 3 poems this evening, all of which are somehow linked to guns and gun violence in our country. I've been working on this project for a couple of years now, and concerned about our rampant gun violence, but also concerned about the polarization in our country. So part of this project's intent was involved me going out and visiting different cities and communities and trying to talk to people about gun violence. So I went to places ranging from Cody to Sandy Hook and cities such as Cleveland and Chicago and Las Vegas. And it was pretty transformative for me in terms of my understanding of the issue. And so I'll read 3 poems from this new manuscript of poems. This is a piece based on my experience that I had in Chicago, or one of several experiences. There I met an artist called Garland Martin Taylor, who was really generous with his time when I was up there. And I got to know his work a little bit. And this poem centers on a work of public art. And I hope the nature of that work is described here in the poem. And I'm sure a lot of you will notice that, I completely ripped off Emily Dickinson in the title here. Here the thing with feathers isn't hope, but a 400-pound pistol in the bed of a pickup, welded together from scrapyard metal and stamped with names of kids shot and killed near the artist's home. Except for all the feathers, dyed cotton candy blue and affixed across its cylinder and grip, wrapping the length of the barrel with a flourish like a boa entwining a neck. It might seem like any other oversized gun. Conversation piece, he called it, although the feathers came later, only after he'd begun driving south with a plan to haul the sculpture from Chicago to Atlanta, then back through Charleston and Sandy Hook. But when he stopped for gas the first time, he knew his art had failed. When a man sprinted across the parking lot to say, "God damn, that's one badass gun." Something needed to change. Maybe the feathers could turn the pistol into a thing you approached with a question instead of praise. And if the plumes now covered some of the names, bearing the elegies hammered into metal, what choice did he have but to continue driving through town after town, listening to the wind's song whipping across the wide mouth of the barrel, tending to the gun now and then from a sack of feathers he kept in the back seat to use whenever storms lashed things loose. I'm not sure if out there in the audience you can hear my dog snoring in the background. I apologize if you can, some editorial from Gloria in the corner there. This is a poem that pivots on Dylan Thomas's great poem, Fern Hill, his poem about nostalgia. and fall from innocence and time and death, among many other things. I appropriate a couple of motifs from that poem. If you haven't read it, I think the only other thing you would need to know is that green is one of the sort of central characters of the poem, the color green. And this is a poem that I hope thinks about mass shootings in our country, but also our normalization of that violence as well. Green means literally 1,000 things or more. So concludes an essay on Fern Hill, in which the student seems somewhere between jazzed up and pissed off that green might mean so many things from one stanza to the next. Here, a blooming Eden proxy. Here, rot made by the grip of time. For starters. Or that sun-slaked field not far from our classroom, as lush green as any Welsh farmyard, grayed overnight with frost. Emerald beer bottle hurled from a car, the slack-jawed lime green goblin face spanning a front porch post-Halloween. For so many weeks, it looks like it's here to stay. The long ago brown green of Cleveland, where it rained always and without pity upon a past I crave despite myself, and our team lost always 14-2. Every time we waited in the bleachers for the game to resume, my father would look down upon the outfield's diagonal lines and proclaim, "Still a lot of green out there," meaning anything can happen and will. Have you ever heard in a crowd the saddest part of Take Me Out to the Ball Game, where everyone lies and pretends we don't care if we ever get back and makes the last word echo twice more? We always want to get back, whether or not we're hailing childhood green. Like the student in her essay, I too could keep rattling off images of spring and decay, June sunset horizon flash, summer hair stained olive from churning over chlorinated pools, green shadow of a hand somewhere that makes it feel as if owls were bearing everything away. Instead of looking again at the image online I glimpsed before returning to my still ungraded hay-high stack of student work. Maybe you saw it too. Maybe you also had the spellbound luck of wandering to other tasks instead of asking what it means to know anything can happen in a wholly different way. Instead of looking once more at the slash of police tape that is the only horizon that matters just now for the two men in the photograph who sit together on the curb, faces glowing blue-red in the lights, both of them bleary-eyed but alive, swaddled in aftermath in a blanket that is green, a detail that couldn't matter less given how the numbers of the dead still rise. Here we are again, as inevitable as the clock's tick, looking in at a place that now will never be young. Is there a way to say it? There's been a shooting that will allow it to be heard, remembered and heard without the easy glide of our past tense, that will stop us from wanting to turn to anything under the wide, starry sky that is not the green fire burning in the minds of those men or the green of a blanket America provides and provides without change. And I'll end with the poem that was selected for the award this year. This is a poem, as was mentioned, that centers on the death of Tamir Rice, who died in 2014 as a 12-year-old shot by Cleveland police officers. I think, like all of us, I was horrified and really haunted by that incident, and also horrified by the lack of justice that followed in the wake of it. And then at the same time, I didn't feel that I could or should necessarily write about the event. I struggled with that for a while. I didn't feel like it was my place as a white man to respond necessarily in a poem. I didn't want to intrude upon anyone's grief. And then at the same time, it seemed like I was concerned about our ability as a country to turn away and to move on from such things. And I think we all know that silence can be a form of complicity too. So this piece, I think, was an effort to work out some of those feelings, and then also just stay with this terrible tragedy for a while as well. The only other thing I'll mention about some of the narrative that's mentioned in the poem is after Tamir Rice was killed, the gazebo where he had been sitting when the police arrived and where he died was turned into a makeshift memorial for him. And to the great shame of Cleveland, they wanted to tear the gazebo down and sort of wipe away the memory of the incident. And the artist, Theaster Gates, based out of Chicago as well, stepped in, purchased the gazebo, and moved it to Chicago to retain it as a place to not only memorialize Tamir Rice, but also to create a space where communities could come together and consider racial inequity and police brutality, and to make sure that that space was kept. So that's mentioned in the poem too. And for better or for worse, the poem starts with a history of the word gazebo. This is called the etymology of gazebo. The etymology of gazebo will always have a hole in it that hauls our guesswork year after year. Most claim it appeared without warning, taking the ending of a future tense for gaze and colliding it with a verb shaped by a pronoun, which gives rise to I shall see, or perhaps I will look, both phrases suggesting a promise still to come. Yet the idea contains a void you have to pretend isn't there. Break open the roots, and you'll need to choose whether to believe in a prefix that hints at the way we see, and an ending that offers the image of a gazebo being pulled apart piece by piece as it's packed up and moved to a city where it'll be built all over again. People are tending to it with care, shoveling dirt, carrying lengths of metal and wood, scraping shingles from the roof, disassembling everything, down to the ribbons knotting the beams, down to the cement picnic table strapped to a chain and hovering a few feet above the ground, while a vehicle somewhere loudly proclaims it's moving backward again. Back up here just a bit, and you may want to ask if it's safe to assume whenever we sit beneath a structure open on all sides that provides shelter from the sun and rain, our hope is to look, to see. We might not have any interest in seeing what's right in front of us, much like the man who, before he strolled off and called the police, sat in the gazebo just a few feet away, silently watching but not seeing a 12-year-old kid holding a toy gun. Is there space here for another theory? Some believe we inherited the word through words no one now speaks that mean honor and heed, although those roots, looking at them now, seem like clusters of letters saying nothing at all. Our words continue to fail, and yet here I sit, peering into the name of some meager thing, unable to stop pulling it apart, as if that offered a kind of prayer, and not, as it sometimes seems, much more than a means to avert my gaze from another child dead too soon. After the gazebo was moved, so that it would not be destroyed, so that there might still be a place to reflect and remember, and this death might not be so easy to forget. The man who preserved it wanted to remind us that words like memorial and honor so often slip through our hands like water. Water that becomes a trampled stretch of snow, which lingers in a park through the end of November, wherever the gazebo's shadow falls. Online, you can see Tamir Rice on the security camera moments before he's shot. Scoop a bit of snow from the grass and shape it into a ball with one hand before walking a few steps and tossing it with a little arc onto the sidewalk where it stays a little while more. Thank you so much for listening and joining us this evening, and thank you again to everyone for this award. It's my pleasure now to turn things over to Paisley Rekdal.
Thank you. That was a beautiful reading. I mean, I want to thank the Southern Humanities Review. I want to thank Charlotte and Rose, and I want to thank Caitlin for the wonderful introduction. And I wish I could be there as well, hearing Matt in person. I've never actually gotten to meet Matt in person, and so it was delightful to hear him read his poems. One of the things that really drew me to his work was I was thinking about the prize, and I was thinking about Jake Adam York's legacy. I was a friend of Jake Adam York's, and Jake's poems and Matt's have something in common. They think widely about history. They think deeply about violence and history, and they are sort of what we would consider like vast, almost moral poems, which I think are really rare to see. I also love Jake's work in general for the ways in which he was an unabashed foodie. That's one of the things that we had in common. So we would eat very lavish meals together, and would talk a lot about barbecue, probably more so than we should have talked about. We should talk more about poetry, because he was a wonderful poet, and he was just a very kind and thoughtful person. And he was very soft-spoken. I will say one last thing about him. It was a shock to hear his death, because we lost him right around the same time we lost a mutual friend named Craig Arnold, who was another wonderful poet, and Craig and Jake were quite close. And it felt, and I know that Jake was really, really distraught over the loss of Craig Arnold, and Craig disappeared in a very mysterious way in Japan, and all of us were very upset, very worried. And then a few months later, Jake was gone. And I can't help but think of the two of them together, because the reality is that, poetry is a precious gift, and the poets that are in our lives and the teachers that are in our lives are also precious too. And you forget that when you realize how quickly they can be taken from you. So I'm honored to be one of the judges for this contest, and I'm honored to be able to pick Matt's poems for it. I think Jake would be quite pleased. All right. I'm going to read some poems. I'm going to read a few from Nightingale, my most recent collection. And many of the poems actually rewrite Ovid's Metamorphoses because, so much time. I thought that would be a good idea. I didn't realize, obviously, how insane a project that was. But the poems, or I should say, the book begins actually in a very Christian way, not a very pagan way. It doesn't begin with a call to a muse, but it does think about asking about creativity, the role of creativity, and it's a poem about a tree that is right across the house, right across the way from my house. And every once in a while it fruits. Sometimes it does not. And this I took as a very deep metaphor. It's called Psalm. Too soon, perhaps, for fruit, and the broad branches ice-sheathed early may bear none. But still my neighbor waits with her ladder and sack for something to break. A gold, a lengthening of light. For the greens to burst into something not unlike flame, the pale fruit blushing over weeks through the furred cleft creases, a freckling of blood. Then the hot, sweet scent of August rot drawing wasps and birds and children through the month. So much abundance and the only cost waiting. Okay, hi. I don't know what happened. Hi. I just love the pandemic. It's been so much fun. Okay. It's live television. Yes. Well, my dog is gone, but he will soon be bursting in here. Anyway. Oh gosh. Okay. The church is far down in the valley. This tree should be an ancient, revered thing placed at the heart of a temple. Instead, it is on a common lot beside a road, apartment buildings, a dog sleeping in its yard. My neighbor has come here neither as master nor supplicant. She simply plans to fill a plastic sack with whatever she can take, the sweet meat giving under the press of a thumb, covering what is its true fruit, the little pit, hard and almond brown that I've scooped out, palmed and planted to no avail. A better gardener could make demands of such a seed, could train a tree for what desire anticipates. But here the tree grows only for itself. And if it bears no fruit for the killing frost, or if it flowers late because of a too warm winter, what debt am I owed? At whose feet should I lay disappointment? Delight, no more comforting nor wounding than hunger. The tree traffics in a singular astonishment, its gold tongues lolling out a song so rich and sweet the notes are left to rot upon the pavement. Is this the only religion left to us? Not one of mortification or desire, not one of suffering, succor, not even of pleasure. The juice of summer coils in the cells. It is a faith that may not come to more than waiting. To insist on pleasure alone is a mark of childishness. To believe only in denial, the fool's prerogative. You hunger because you hunger, and the tree calls to this. But the fruit is real. I have eaten it, have plucked and washed and cut the weight, and stewed it with sugar and lemon peel until the gold ran rich and thick into jars. I have spooned it over bread and meat. I have sucked it from my husband's fingers. I have watched it sour in its pots until a mist of green bubbled up for a crust. I have gathered and failed it as the tree for me both ripens and fallows. But now it is perhaps too soon for fruit. The winter this year was hard, the air full of smokes. And do I know if spring reached the valley in time? Who planted this tree? How long has it stood here? How many more years can such a thing remain? My neighbor reaches a hand up into the branches, palm cupped, weighing the leaf knots. She is looking to see what instincts, what weathers still grow here. She snakes her hand through the greening branches. Up from the valley come the golden tongues of bells. So, there's a couple of poems that deal with art in the book, and I know we would normally be reading in an art museum and thinking about that connection between the visual arts and poetry. This is something that actually I was thinking about recently because I was at an artist talk at our own UMFA, and the artist was named Mel Chin, and he described making a piece of art as a political statement. And the piece of art that I describe is basically what he tried to create. But I couldn't help but think about the violence it took to create this art and what the violence of that art was trying to protest. Horn of Plenty. Would you do what this artist did? The one who bought fresh goat's blood to pour over the cornucopia he sculpted in protest of the war, its dark mouth large enough for a yearling kid to sleep in, head tucked between the glossy hooves. For in his mind, the animal was clean, the farm a bright, mechanical place where anyone could buy clear bags of meat and blood. But the farm, he found, was poor, its owner's health failing, and so the artist, chagrined perhaps by his ambitions, watched as the farmer trudged into a muddy copse with a pail to pull two thin animals into his barn. Then he locked his knees around the smallest one's neck, its hips and triangular head twisting in his grip, so he levered the blade clumsily across the goat's gullet, forced now to saw through the tough neck muscles, the animal's head violently shaking, no, 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 until the head pulled free and was thrown upon the ground. Then the farmer knelt down and punched his knife through the belly to pull out viscera, fresh and hot, the dark blood pumping into his pail as the other goat backed up against the far wall, screaming. Would you have chosen to stop? Or would you have continued, knowing you wanted the blood because of the horn, symbol both of plenty and of suffering, because it was a goat who nursed the god who snapped this horn off once in play, and blessed it later to be forgiven? That the horn recalled the grain of the once fertile nation your country has invaded, a country from which your government says now it can't withdraw, its fields and infrastructure depleted by years of drought and war. The goat is ancient, milky-eyed. She's half blind, though she can smell what's happened to her companion. The whole barn is thick with the death that will now be hers. Would you keep on going? Does the first animal's suffering only make sense if you complete your art, finish the sculpture in a way the war will never be finished, the great horn clotted with blood and displayed in the foyer of the museum that commissioned it? The show will be titled after a line from the Iliad, freighted with dark pains, a description of the arrow shot by one soldier into the heart of another. The curators chose the title for the beauty of that line, perhaps for its suggestion that the body giving and the body receiving pain were equally blameless. Only the arrow delivers sorrow. Only the arrow aches as it rips through skin and muscle into the tender flank of the animal you are even now stroking in your arms. How can you not hush and cluck at her, soothing this goat the way you'd soothe the fears of anyone you loved, bending down to gather her body tightly against your own, because the animal is old, already dying, because you're tired of watching such frantic suffering, and because it is not your knife carrying the pain. I feel like I should read something really short because I'm terrified that the internet will go out. And I'm going to read something wildly different. It's going to be like emotional whiplash for all of us. This is from my collection, Imaginary Vessels. And in this book, I was thinking about vessels of history, vessels of the imagination. And one of the vessels that I was thinking about was actually Mae West, who was a personal heroine of mine. Some of you might not know who Mae West was. You can Google her, YouTube her later. She was a vaudeville actress who went into the talkies later on. She was blonde. She was very well endowed. And she was a comedian of sort of epic proportions. And I will do my Mae West impersonation. She had a very distinctive voice, and you'll probably recognize it from the voice. We wouldn't really have people like Marilyn Monroe without her. She really paved the way. She was sort of outrageously open about her sexuality, outrageously sort of flirtatious, very, very, very funny about men, about money, but she was also, very kitschy, very campy and things like that. So I kind of grew up wanting to be Mae West. I don't even know when I first saw her. My mother would take me to the grocery store and I'd be dressed as Mae West. I went dressed as Mae West for my high school, not my high school, my middle school talent contest, and considered it was a Catholic school that didn't go over as well as you might imagine. But anyway, I wrote a series of sonnets and I try to capture her humor. And most of the sonnets basically either begin or end with one of her famous one-liners. And the rest of the sonnet either is an anagram of one of those famous one-liners or can only be written with words composed of the letters that show up in the one-liner. I'm going to read you a couple of anagrammatical sonnets, and they end with one of her famous one-liners, and I will do my Mae West impersonation. This is the first one. Mae West, advice. Ban tobacco. Do bacon a bed. Be delectable, collectible, a decent debacle. Décolleté, don't conceal, acne, do. Be bold and be toned, an octane blonde coed. Be colonel not cadet, concede nada to doc. Did a cad and canoodle, be a clat on a cot. Don't lean on a deacon, be a dolt, a clone. Don't bet on an Eden, don't loot, don't loan. Be bell and ball too, a deb cocoa labeled. Be ocelot, be lancet, be candle and cabled. Cancelled, debated, booed at to boot. Elect to be tall, don't tan, eat local. Be oded, caboodled, be beacon and lect. Oh, don't be a noodle, be cool and collect. It's sort of creepy when there's no audience and you're giggling to yourself because you just think you're so charming. All right. So anyway, here's the last one of the anagrammatical sonnets. Self-portrait as Mae West one-liner. I'm no moaning bluet, mountable linnet, mumbling nun. I'm tangible, I'm gin, able to molt in toto to limb. I'm blame and angle, I'm lumbago, an oblate mug gone notable, not glum. I'm a taboo tuba mogul, I'm motile, I'm nimble, no gab ennui, no bagel bun boat, I'm one big megaton bolt able to bail men out. Gluten I am, male bong unit, I'm a genial bum, mental OB, genital montage. I'm agent limbo, my blunt bio an amulet, an enigma, omit Alan, omit bingo, alien mangle, I'm glib lingo, untangle me tangelo, but I'm no angel. Again, just laughing at my own jokes. I'm going to read a couple of poems actually from a new collection I'm working on. As Poet Laureate of Utah, I was commissioned to write a poem to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in Utah, just about 100 miles away from where I live now. And I'm half Chinese, and I don't think they knew that, but I was very excited to write a poem about the Transcontinental for the state celebration. I don't think they understood what they were going to get exactly, but I wanted to create a sort of document that thinks about the impact, the cultural impact of the railroad. And one of the things that I did was I took a poem from Angel Island, which was written in Chinese. It was carved on the walls of Angel Island, which is basically the Ellis Island of the West, where the Chinese were housed and detained for up to 2 to 3 years during the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act basically happened very quickly after the Transcontinental was completed. When the Transcontinental was being built, they were eager to have Chinese labor. As soon as it was finished, they no longer wanted the Chinese in America. They thought it was a threat racially. They thought it was another kind of slavery, so it was a threat to white workers. And so I wanted to start the poem with Chinese, and the poem itself is a translation of the Chinese poem. I take each character and I turn it into a historical document that looks at one impact of the transcontinental on American culture. This is a poem that translates to have knowledge, and it is based on an immigration questionnaire that was given to Chinese claiming to be former U.S. residents, or for the Chinese entering the country during the Chinese Exclusion Act. Have you ridden in a streetcar? Can you describe the taste of bread? Where are the Joss houses located in the city? Do Jackson Street and DuPont run in a circle or a line? What is the fruit your mother ate before she bore you? How many letters a year do you receive from your father? Of which material is your ancestral hall now built? How many water buffalo does your uncle own? Do you love him? Do you hate her? What kind of bird sang at your parents' wedding? What are the birth dates for each of your cousins? Did your brother die from starvation, work, or murder? Do you know the price of tea here? Have you ever touched a stranger's face as he slept? Did it snow the year you first wintered in our desert? How much weight is a bucket and a hammer? Which store is opposite your grandmother's? Did you sleep with that man for money? Did you sleep with that man for love? Name the color and number of all your mother's dresses, now your village's rivers. What diseases of the heart do you carry? What country do you see when you think of your children? Does your sister ever write? In which direction does her front door face? How many steps did you take when you finally left her? How far did you walk before you looked back? I'm going to read one other poem, and it's going to be embarrassing because I'm going to have to read off my screen, so I'll be looking sort of around you. This poem translates, the character title translates to sad, and it is what I'm calling a presidential contrapuntal. One of the presidents that came right swiftly after the building of the Transcontinental was Andrew Johnson, who shares some interesting aspects with our current president. He was impeached. He was also considered somebody to use his influence unduly. And he took a little thing called a swing around the circle train tour, which is sort of an impromptu speaking tour, in order to sort of drum up more public support for his causes. And this is what was written of him in 1866. If he would stay in the White House, keep his mouth shut, and not make a fool of himself, disgusting friend and foe alike, the President of the United States might command some respect. Potter County Journal, 1866. The contrapuntal, I did not write a word of this. One section is Andrew Johnson's speeches, and one section is President Trump's speeches. I will read them independently of each other, and then I will read them together. Together means that they would actually form a sort of wing-like structure. At this particular crisis of the American people, I cling to the Constitution, notwithstanding a mendacious press, that common gang of cormorants and bloodsuckers. The pains Congress has taken to malign what all patriotic men should rally round. There is no power that can control me. Before I would see this government destroyed, I would send every Negro back to Africa. I will indeed be your Moses. There are a good many people, but this is a country for white men, hence you can see why I have been assaulted. I hand over to you this flag, though imprisoned. I feel confident you agree to the same great doctrine, if these are your tender mercies, God. We have shattered the mentality, the broken promises, jobless recoveries, tired platitudes. Nobody has done anything like I've been able to do. I alone can fix that strong border. They want a wall, that Chinese virus, I call it, because when somebody is president of the United States, that authority is total to silence your voices on social media. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crimes, sad. And then you get into legal semantics on both sides. So we had a campaign. Sorry, women, thank you for that big victory. It's called total acquittal, and now I am your voice. I view everybody as a threat except for possibly Abe Lincoln. There will be no lies. And this is the poem as a whole. At this particular crisis, we have shattered the mentality of the American people. I cling to the Constitution, the broken promises, jobless recoveries, tired platitudes. Notwithstanding a mendacious press, nobody has done anything like I've been able to do. That common gang of cormorants and bloodsuckers, I alone can fix the pains Congress has taken to malign that strong border. They want a wall, what all patriotic men should rally round. That Chinese virus, I call it, because there is no power that can control me. When somebody is president of the United States, that authority is total. Before I would see this government destroyed to silence your voices on social media, I would send every Negro back to Africa. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crimes, sad. I will indeed be your Moses. And then you get into legal semantics. There are a good many people on both sides. So we had a campaign, but this is a country for white men. Sorry, women. Thank you for that big victory. Hence, you can see why I have been assaulted. It's called total acquittal, and now I hand over to you this flag. Though imprisoned, I am your voice. I view everybody as a threat. I feel confident you agree to the same great doctrine, except for possibly Abe Lincoln. If these are your tender mercies, God, there will be no lies. And I'll just read one last poem. And this is the end of Imaginary Vessels. It's called Mortal Love. If we were immortal, the poet said, like the Greek gods, love would not be needed because time ceases to matter. Love needs urgency to be felt at all. At which point I left the hall, hurrying home to cook us dinner and change the sheets, to sit a moment and rest before you came back home to me, thinking all the time of the gods in our stories who, even with eternity to spare, loved, which brought them into the human realms of war and murder, the chaining of lesser beings in pits of flame, the skinning of rivals, and the creation of children sometimes beautiful, sometimes monstrous. The need for the shapes and skins of animals to disguise their desires, meaning the gods knew guilt too, and shame and jealousy. They knew, as we tell ourselves, about all the human emotions in which love is rooted, self-love and love for spouses, daughters, sons, other people's wives, the love for ex-lovers too, those secret old needs flamed out, but the ashes nursed out of respect for the failure. The gods loved because we wanted them to be like us. No, it is not an excess of time that would keep them from feeling it. Love embroiders time, moving in and out of what we imagine of it or what, if we were gods, we could finally know. For them, death is the thing that is expendable. Eternity means only that suffering can be withstood because it may be forgotten, because we are the ones who must exist in the quick sharpening and dulling of whatever wounds assert us as human. If we are different from the gods, it is because we are more afraid. Our sweet, dim, ordinary pleasures necessary to assuage what can't be forgotten. An instinct where theirs is an indulgence, and so our love is deeper, more frightening, more terrible than theirs. The gods loved, but they loved only as like us as they could. They could never match it. They would never match it. And it is because of all the things they loved, eternity would teach them to covet most their power and their will. We have these things too, in abundance, but not time, for love needs no time at all. Thank you.
Thank you both. I wish you could hear us clapping, but we were doing the equivalent, believe it. I'm Rose McClarney, and as the co-editor of Southern Humanities Review, I'll be moderating a brief Q&A with our guests. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Though I can't include them all, I've tried to select some good representatives. And I think this first question will be something that both of you could answer if you'd like. Does poetry, even as it describes injustices, help you find hope? And how do you explain to others why it's worth spending time on poetry?
You go first, Matt.
Wow. That's a huge question. So the question was, I'm sorry, can you just repeat the second
Sure.
part of it again?
Well, it was a two-part question, so that makes it hard.
Okay.
Maybe you can just answer the part of it that speaks to you. But does poetry, even as it describes injustices, help you find hope? Or how do you explain to others why it's worth spending time on poetry?
Yeah, what a big question, and what an important one. So, I'll be excited to hear what Paisley says about this, but I would say a couple of things from my own perspective, and that is, I hope that poetry can help bring injustices into focus, to help us understand them in a new way through a new context. And I also hope that, especially in this era with how disparaged the language has been, that simply the act of, finely tuned attention to the possibilities of language is something that is cathartic and meaningful, and especially when it's trying to address issues of injustice or violence, that it helps us understand things not simply, but by virtue of it being rarefied. Paisley, what would you say?
Well, I think you're totally right about the fact that poetry asks us to pay attention to language. And one of the first things that happens in any kind of political regime is that language gets, weaponized, taken away, made useless, made, so that people don't trust, people speak in euphemisms about what's actually happening. And poetry, even as it uses metaphor, resists euphemism, interestingly. And I think that that's one of the things that is so important for studying it, for spending time with it. I don't think I myself ever go to poetry to feel comforted or better, or to feel, how should I say it? To feel as if the poem is ever going to take the place of actual protest or actual activism. I think poetry is always a supplement to that. Poetry is an engagement, is maybe a first entry into that kind of thing. And it's because we have to spend time thinking about how language has shaped us and how we are shaping others through our language. And there's, I can't think of any other tool to better resist demagoguery than, critical thinking and critical attention to language.
And I just add quickly too, there are times when I do turn to poetry to, understand an incident or understand an act of violence, something that is addressing a really contemporary moment. And other times I turn to poetry simply for the pleasures of language. And sometimes, it's about a poem that focuses on Mae West with a really kick-ass impression of Mae West at the end of it, and that is what I turn to poetry for and hope it can provide. It's the pleasures of language itself that afford something in this moment that is outside of this moment very happily too.
Yeah, I have to say, like, working on the Transcontinental Railroad project, there was something surprising that came with spending so much time with the 19th century and historical documents from the 19th century. At first, it was depressing to see how similar the language was, similar the issues were, how repetitive in some ways American history is. But then it also gave me a weird little piercing moment of hope, which is that at that moment, it was much worse in America. You had Reconstruction, you had Jim Crow, you had race riots, you had labor riots, you had the cholera. Actually, it's the same. Okay, it's exactly the same. It was exactly the same, but a little worse, right? They actually had a couple of depressions and things like that that were, not as bad as the Great Depression, but they were there. So many of the same things we're living with. But it was worse because at that moment, the country really did not know. And it was really clear that it wasn't clear that the country was going to survive. And then you read these documents and you think from a safe distance, we did survive. We changed, we got better. And then, followed swiftly by a form of depression, which is, why are we back in it? Why are we back in this language? Why are we back in these issues? But it's that circularity, the recursiveness of that history that in some ways both fills me with hope and more resolution, which is like, if they can do this, if they got better, if they could push the country in a more progressive direction, there's no reason we can't.
Thank you. This question was addressed to you, Paisley, and it specific to Nightingale, which contemporizes material from Ovid's Metamorphosis, but I think it might also pertain to some of your other work. And it is, when you're undertaking a project like this, do you find yourself more drawn to something left unsaid in the text itself, or drawn to an idea in the text you want to articulate further, or drawn to an idea outside the text? So this person is interested in how you're working from your sort of source material.
That's a great question. The cheap and easy way to deal with it is to say both. And the reason is because sometimes what was left unsaid in Ovid needed to be said. And I say that as a woman because many of the poems that Ovid wrote involved violence against women. And to a certain extent, there's a lot of silence that the women kind of descend into after these moments of assault and violence. And but oftentimes those women also turn to art, visual art, in order to get some sense of justice, to get some sort of retribution. But I feel like there needed to be something more said around that. What are the problems of that? What are the rewards of that? And so I wanted to articulate that mostly for myself. So there's a really long essay in the middle of the book that does that. But there are also moments in the book that I just found, or in the myths that I just found so mesmerizing, and they were so quiet. I didn't want to articulate them at all, and nor did I want to duplicate them. They were so perfect as they were. So for me, I found myself trying to hone in on text to really answer a question like, what does it mean to change? And to articulate all the different ways in which people over the course of their lives change and maybe don't change. I don't know if I answered that question very well, but because it's such a good one though, but I'm trying to figure out like, am I articulating something or am I just duplicating something?
No, thank you. It was good. I thought that was a good answer.
I'll go with it.
Then this one was addressed to you. As Paisley said, I think your poems are vast in a way that Jake Adam York's are as well. So this is a student writer who wants to know when and how you decide to end a poem, or maybe decide that it's a series of poems or an essay or something else, but how you determine the shape of one of those vast poems.
Yeah, no, that's a great question too. I guess, so I would say I never know what I'm doing at all. Every time I start a poem or whatever it might be, I flail, I thrash, I collapse into self-doubt. I try a number of different attempts. And so usually for me, if I end up with about 20 pages of messy notes that seem to be going all over the place, that actually is bizarrely really reassuring to me. It means that I'm sort of on the right track, and that becomes, that messiness becomes something that is familiar to me. And from there, there's sort of a gradual distillation that goes on. So what I try to do is just make, I try and make it less terrible every single day. That's usually my goal when I'm working through a poem. And in terms of the ending question, how to end a poem, I hardly ever know where a poem's going to end. So that's part of the distillation process too. And for me, it's really essential that I be surprised by where a poem ends. And if I land on an ending too quickly, I really mistrust it. And usually I feel like I'm right to mistrust it. It ends up being a kind of, more hollow gesture than what could have happened. And then in terms of, different genres, that's a great question too. I've had plenty of poems that have started out as essays, as even like acts of literary journalism. As I was talking about that gun project, I thought I was going to write a much more straightforward work of investigative literary journalism about guns. And it turned out that wasn't going to work for a variety of reasons. But one of them is I was really surprised at the way in which poetry was a much more resonant tool to use to address this topic that is so divisive. So I think poetry became, through its focus on association or, through a lyric impulse, became a way to sort of shake up what otherwise can be, a really reductive issue that has a kind of prescribed ending and stance assigned to it from a lot of people. So poems afforded that opportunity for me. So I was surprised. There's an example of I was surprised at the way in which poetry served me for that content. So that's all a long way of saying I never know what I'm doing. And I work through it, but that's just the way it goes with my own process.
Well, thank you both for those answers and for spending your time sharing your work with us this evening. We regret that everyone is not gathered in Auburn in the museum getting their copies of your books signed, but we're grateful that we can still gather in this way. And would like to share with the audience links for purchasing books by this evening's readers, which, there you go, you should see on the screen. They've both published a number of titles of both creative nonfiction and poetry, which you can get through the independent booksellers that they recommend at these links, or you can get them through your usual sources. You may also want to read and subscribe to Southern Humanities Review, the quarterly literary journal in which Donovan's winning poem is appearing. So I encourage you to visit southernhumanities.review.com if you're interested in that. Thank you again, everyone. I will turn this over for closing remarks of the evening to Cindy Malonick.
Thank you, Rose. And what a wonderful evening, right? We, in the midst of so much uncertainty, to experience and hear the words of these two amazing poets who brought clarity and honesty and sincerity. It was really remarkable. And Mae West impressionism was awesome. It was a history lesson. Who knew we would get to talk about presidents tonight while we've got, I think, dueling town halls on television. So it's just been a really special evening. Paisley, thank you for your comments and your nod to notions of creativity and visual arts and museums and artists. It was wonderful. And Matt, your profound poem reminds me of a piece in our collection by a renowned and deceased now African-American artist, a female, Elizabeth Catlett, 1970 lithograph entitled The Torture of Mothers. And in it, she depicts a young boy who could be probably Tamir Rice's age or so, and he's lying down in a wash of red, and it's obviously in her mind. And she's, her eyes are looking upward, but she's obviously tortured and distraught. And 50 years later, 1970 is when she drew this. 50 years later, there's still so much pain, right? It's the reality of the Black experience in the United States. And so it's your words, that art this evening, it's a clarion call for all of us, for poets, for artists, for museums, for campuses, for humans, to work to propel the dialogue forward. So we were so honored to have all of you with us tonight, Congratulations again, Matt. Thank you, Paisley, for being such an amazing juror. I wish you all well and hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you. Good night.